My name is Russell Whitaker. I am 53 years old, and I've lived in eastern Oklahoma for most of my life. For over 20 years, I've worked as a high school guidance counselor in a small town outside of McAllister. Fishing has always been my routine before work, especially during the fall when the air is cooler and the lake is calm. In 2018, I kept a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat at a marina on Lake Eufaula. I preferred launching before sunrise. The lake is different at that hour. The water is flat, and there's usually no one around except a few serious anglers. I would arrive around 5 a.m., back the trailer down the ramp, and idle out toward a quiet cove I liked on the northern side. The first time I noticed the other boat was in late September. It was still dark when I reached the mouth of the cove. My navigation lights reflected off the water in a narrow red and green pattern. About 200 yards ahead, I saw a single white light resting low above the surface. It was steady and unmoving. That wasn't unusual on its own. Other fishermen often anchor early and wait for first light. What stood out was a stillness. I didn't hear an engine. I didn't hear the soft hum of a trolling motor. The light just remained there, as if suspended. I cut my engine and let my boat drift while I prepared my first cast. I checked again after a few minutes. The light had shifted slightly closer, though I had heard no movement across the water. I assumed the person might be using an electric trolling motor. Those could be nearly silent. I continued fishing and didn't give it much thought. The next morning, I saw it again, this time in a different cove along the same stretch of shoreline. Same white light, same stillness. It stayed at a distance, not approaching directly, but never fully leaving my view. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated. I saw the same small boat at least 6 or 7 times, always before sunrise and always at a moderate distance. I never heard a motor start. I never saw anyone cast a line. The boat would be present in the dim light, then gone once the sun rose high enough to clearly see the water. In mid-October, I decided to pay closer attention. I arrived even earlier than usual, around 4:45 a.m., when the sky was still completely dark. As I idled toward open water, I saw the white light already positioned near one of my usual fishing spots. It was as if it had arrived before me and settled into place. This time, the distance between us was closer, maybe 75 yards. I could make out the silhouette of a man sitting near the front of the boat. He appeared to be facing in my direction. He wasn't casting or adjusting gear. He was just sitting there. I raised a hand in a small wave, more out of habit than anything else. There was no response, no movement. I told myself he might not have seen me clearly in the dark. I began casting along the shoreline, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I glanced over. The boat had shifted slightly each time, repositioning without any visible effort. There were no ripples indicating a motor had engaged. Eventually, I decided to approach more directly. I started my engine at idle speed and steered slowly toward him. The water was calm enough that I should have heard even the faintest sound from his boat if it had moved. When I got within about 30 yards, I slowed again. I could see the outline of the boat clearly now. It was another aluminum fishing boat, similar in size to mine. The man's figure was still at the bow, sitting upright. I called out, "Morning." There was no reply. The white light suddenly turned off. In the growing gray light of dawn, I could see the boat more clearly. It was drifting slightly to the right. There was no one inside it. No man at the bow. No movement. No fishing rods visible. The front seat was empty. I paused, unsure if the lighting had played a trick on me. I had been certain I saw someone sitting there. The posture had been distinct. I drifted closer and circled slowly at a distance of about 20 feet. The boat appeared unoccupied. There was a small electric trolling motor mounted at the stern, but it wasn't running. No cooler, no tackle box in sight. The lake's surface was undisturbed. There had been no splash, no sound of someone entering the water. After a moment, I felt it was better to give it space. I backed away slightly. As I adjusted my throttle and looked down briefly, I heard nothing unusual. When I looked up again, the boat had moved farther out toward open water. I watched carefully this time. It didn't accelerate. It didn't create a wake. It simply drifted beyond the mouth of the cove. Within a minute, it was far enough away that the dim light made it hard to distinguish from the water's surface. Then it was gone. I didn't see it reach the main channel. I didn't hear an engine start. I returned to the marina earlier than usual that morning. I mentioned the empty drifting boat to the attendant on duty and asked if anyone had reported equipment missing. He said no. All boats accounted for as far as he knew. For the next week, I continued launching before sunrise. Partly out of curiosity, the white light returned twice more, always at a distance and always steady. I never approached it again. Each time, the boat would remain motionless until the sky brightened. Then it would no longer be visible. By early November, I changed my routine. I started arriving after sunrise instead. I told myself it was because the temperature was dropping and I preferred more daylight. That was true, but it wasn't the only reason. I haven't seen the boat since. I still fish Lake Eufaula on weekends. During the day, it looks like any other busy Oklahoma reservoir. Families in pontoons, tournament anglers, jet skis crossing open water. Sometimes, when I arrive early enough to see the faint glow of lights across the lake, I wait in my truck until the sun is high enough to clearly outline every boat on the surface. I prefer to see who is out there, because in the dim light before sunrise, I know what I saw more than once. A man sitting at the bow of a quiet boat, facing me without moving, and when I got close enough to confirm it, there was no one there. My name is Garrett Nolan. I am 44 years old, and I used to work as a medical supply delivery driver in northern Minnesota. In 2020, my route covered several small towns outside of Bemidji, places like Black Duck, Kelleher, and long rural stretches where houses were miles apart. The job was steady and quiet. I drove a white cargo van and delivered oxygen tanks, mobility equipment, and boxed medical supplies to clinics and private homes. During the winter months, most of my driving happened in darkness. The sun came up late and disappeared early, and the roads were often buried under fresh snow. County Road 12 was part of my regular route. It was a narrow two-lane road with dense forest on one side and open fields on the other. There were no street lights and very few driveways along a particular 3-mile stretch near mile marker 15. In heavy snowfall, the county plows would carve a single clean path and leave tall ridges of snow along both sides. Beyond those ridges, the snow remained untouched and smooth. The first time I noticed a line was in early January after an overnight storm. I left Bemidji before dawn and the road had just been cleared. The sky was still dark blue, and my headlights reflected off the snow in front of me. As I approached mile marker 15, I saw something unusual running parallel to the road on the right side. There was a straight groove in the snow, about 4 inches wide and shallow, maybe an inch deep. It ran perfectly alongside the road, about 2 feet from the plowed edge. It looked like something long and narrow had been dragged steadily through the snow. The line was too clean to be random. It didn't wobble or curve. It stayed straight, following the road for several hundred feet before disappearing where the snowdrift rose higher near a bend. At the time, I assumed it was related to farm equipment. Snowmobiles were common in that area, and people sometimes pulled sleds or gear behind them. I didn't think about it again that day. The next morning, after another light snowfall overnight, the line was back. The snow had been deep enough to erase everything from the previous day. There were no tire marks in the open areas, no animal tracks crossing the fields, just a smooth white surface, except for that same narrow groove running parallel to the road in the exact same location. I slowed my van as I passed it. I tried to see if there were footprints nearby. There were none. The groove was alone in the snow. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw it repeatedly. Not every day, But after each fresh snowfall, it reappeared, always starting around the same stretch, always maintaining the same distance from the road. It never crossed over into the plowed lane. It never angled toward the trees. It just followed the road quietly and precisely. One afternoon, near the end of my route, I decided to stop and take a closer look. It was around 4:30 p.m., already dark. Snow had fallen lightly that morning, leaving a clean layer on top of older accumulation. I pulled onto the shoulder and turned on my hazard lights. The air was completely still when I stepped out. The forest beside the road looked dense and black beyond the snowbanks. I walked carefully toward the groove, stepping over the plowed ridge. Up close, the line looked even more deliberate. The edges were smooth, as if something had slid without interruption. There were no side scuffs, no breaks in the pattern. It didn't look like something had been carried or dropped. It looked like something had moved steadily forward without lifting. I followed it for about 20 yards until it reached a drift where the snow was deeper. There, the groove simply ended. It didn't taper off gradually. It just stopped, as if whatever had been making it had lifted straight up from the snow. I stood there longer than I intended to. The quiet felt heavier than usual. No wind, no distant engines. Just the faint ticking sound of my van's cooling engine behind me. I went back to work and tried to put it out of my mind. But one morning in late January, something changed. A heavy snowfall had ended only an hour before I left town. The road had not yet been plowed. I was driving through fresh, untouched snow, my tires the first marks on the surface. As I approached mile marker 15, I saw the groove already there. The road was completely smooth except for my own tracks and that straight line running beside it. That meant whatever had made it had passed through after the snow stopped falling. But before I arrived, possibly within the last hour, I slowed to a near stop. My headlights followed the line forward. About 50 yards ahead, near the tree line, I noticed a darker shape standing upright against the snow. It wasn't detailed enough to identify clearly. It appeared narrow and vertical, darker than the surrounding trees. It could have been a signpost or a small sapling, but I had driven that road hundreds of times and never noticed anything in that exact spot. As I approached slowly, the shape seemed to shift slightly, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed a change in position. Then it was no longer there. There was no clear movement I could describe. It didn't run or fall. It simply wasn't visible anymore. I stopped the van and stepped out again. The snow was untouched around the tree line. No footprints, no disturbances. The groove in the snow led directly toward the area where I had seen the shape, then ended about 10 feet before the trees. There was no continuation into the forest. I did not follow it further that morning. After that, I became more aware of the timing. The groove always appeared after fresh snow. It never overlapped with older tracks. It never showed signs of turning back. It always moved in one direction along that same stretch of road. I mentioned it casually to a coworker one afternoon, describing it as a strange snow pattern. He suggested maybe someone was pulling a thin metal pole or a cable along the roadside. That explanation sounded reasonable at first, but it didn't account for the lack of footprints or vehicle tracks. By March, temperatures began rising and the snow melted away. The road returned to bare asphalt and patches of gravel. The groove stopped appearing. When winter came again the following year, I half expected to see it return. And it did. The first major snowfall of December covered the ground overnight. The next morning, as I approached mile marker 15, the line was there once more. Same width, same distance from the road, same steady direction. I never saw the dark shape again, but occasionally, while driving past that stretch in heavy snow, I had the sense that something was moving just beyond the reach of my headlights. Not approaching, not retreating, just keeping pace. In early 2022, I changed jobs and stopped driving that route. I haven't traveled County Road 12 in winter. Since then, in summer, it looks ordinary. Trees, fields, mailboxes spaced far apart. Nothing unusual about it. But when I think back to those winters, I don't focus on the shape I thought I saw near the trees. I think about the groove itself, the precision of it, the way it appeared only after fresh snow, as if it had waited for the surface to reset. I never found footprints. I never saw anyone creating it, and I never heard any sound that explained how it was made. It simply ran parallel to the road, calm and deliberate, as if following a path it already knew. And every time it ended just before the forest began. My name is Leonard Bishop. I am 47 years old, and in 2021 I worked as the resident manager of a storage facility outside of Yuma, Arizona. The facility sat on the edge of town, close to open desert and a stretch of highway that stayed quiet at night. There were about 200 storage units arranged in long metal rows, all surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. My responsibilities were straightforward. I handled rentals, collected payments, and checked the property each morning for anything unusual. I also lived in a small one-bedroom apartment attached to the main office, which meant I was technically on site at all hours. The gate system was electronic. Tenants had personal access codes they entered on a keypad near the entrance. Every entry was logged automatically. The system recorded the time, the code used, and how long the gate stayed open. There was also a manual override button inside the office. That button could only be pressed from a control panel mounted on the wall behind the front desk. In April of that year, I noticed something in the daily log that didn't make sense. At 2:15 a.m. the previous night, the gate had opened. The log listed the action as manual override. There was no code attached to it. That immediately caught my attention because the only way to activate manual override was to physically press the button inside the office. I had been asleep in my apartment at that time. I hadn't left my bed. I assumed it was some kind of glitch. Systems fail. Software misrecords events. I checked the security footage to confirm. The video showed the gate sliding open slowly. The headlights from the road did not change. No vehicle pulled in. No one walked through. The gate stayed open for about 30 seconds and then closed on its own. I reviewed footage from the camera facing the inside driveway. No movement. The lot remained still. I contacted the security company that monitored the system. They ran diagnostics remotely and told me everything looked normal. No remote activation. No signs of interference. They suggested that perhaps the button had been pressed earlier in the day and logged late. That explanation didn't satisfy me, but I let it go. A week later, it happened again. 2:14 a.m. manual override. Gate opened and closed. No visible entry. This time, I checked every camera feed carefully. As the gate opened, the motion light near row C activated briefly, even though no one appeared in frame. The light remained on for about 20 seconds before turning off again. Row C contained about 30 units. Most of them were rented by long-term customers who rarely visited. One unit in particular, C17, was rented by an older couple storing seasonal decorations and furniture. They had not accessed their unit in over a month. The next morning, I walked the property and paid closer attention to that row. All doors appeared closed and locked. No scratches on the ground. No sign of tampering. The third incident occurred 3 nights later, at 2:16 a.m. This time, I happened to wake up for no particular reason. I checked the clock beside my bed. It was 2:13 a.m. I was fully awake when I heard the faint mechanical hum of the gate motor outside. I got up and walked into the office area. The control panel was mounted on the wall. No one else was inside. The gate motor sound lasted about half a minute, then stopped. I checked the camera monitor immediately. The footage showed the gate closing. I rewound to see what had triggered it. At 2:15 a.m., the manual override button had been activated. I watched the camera focus directly on the panel. The button moved inward as if pressed by a finger. It depressed fully, held for a fraction of a second, and then returned to its normal position. There was no hand in frame, no shadow crossing the wall, nothing touching it. I replayed that clip several times. The motion was subtle but clear. The button physically moved. I replaced the panel the following week with a newer model. I assumed perhaps the internal wiring had malfunctioned. The activity continued. Sometimes it would skip a week. Other times it happened 2 nights in a row. Always between 2:12 and 2:18 a.m. Always manual override. In early June, I decided to stay awake and sit inside the office around that time. I turned off the interior lights so the camera view would be clearer. At 2:14 a.m., I stood directly in front of the control panel. I watched it closely. At 2:15 a.m., the button depressed. I did not touch it. I was at least a foot away. I could see my own hands clearly in the dim light. The gate motor activated immediately. I stepped outside into the driveway. The desert air was dry and still. No wind, no passing cars. The gate was halfway open. Beyond it, the highway remained empty. As the gate reached its fully open position, the motion light near row C turned on again. I walked quickly in that direction. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. But as I reached the center of the row, I noticed that Unit C-17's door was slightly raised, just an inch or 2 off the ground. I approached slowly. Before I reached it, the door lowered back into place with a soft metallic sound. I froze. I had not touched it. There was no visible mechanism pulling it down. It simply settled shut. The padlock remained intact. I stood there for several minutes, listening. There was no sound from inside the unit. The next morning, I contacted the renters of C-17 and asked if they had visited late at night. They had not. They came by later that week to inspect their belongings. Nothing was missing or disturbed. In July, the log entries changed. Instead of manual override, one night it recorded access granted, code 0000. There was no code 0000 programmed into the system. The footage from that night was different. When the gate opened, something crossed the threshold. It was difficult to describe. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, low to the ground, moving steadily. The motion lights did not activate as it passed beneath them. The cameras flickered briefly when it reached row C. For a moment, C-17's door was fully open in the frame. The inside of the unit looked completely black. After about 30 seconds, the gate closed again. The next morning, C-17 was shut and locked. No sign of forced entry. By August, I was not sleeping well. Not because I felt threatened, but because I could not explain what I was seeing. I felt responsible for maintaining the property, and I had no clear answer for the owner. I resigned at the end of that month and moved to Tucson for a different maintenance job. As far as I know, the facility is still operating normally. I never followed up with a new manager to ask if the incidents continued. I only know what I witnessed personally. A control panel button pressing itself inward at 2:15 a.m. A gate opening to an empty road. A storage unit door lifting slightly and lowering again without a visible cause. There were no broken locks, no missing items, no reports of trespassing, just a system that opened on its own, always at the same time, as if allowing something through that did not need a code.